you're a strange Marxist to have a discussion with. And, well, but here's why. This is not an insult by any stretch of the imagination.
No.
I mean, one of the things that struck me when I was looking at your work was that you're, well, first of all, you're a character, you know, and that's an interesting thing. Like you're.
Is this an insult or not?
It's not an insult. It's a sign of originality, and it's a sign of a certain amount of moral courage, and it's a sign of a certain temperament, and it makes you humorous and charismatic and attractive, and I think you appeal to young people the way that outside intellectual rebels appeal to young people. And so those are all positive things that can be used positively or negatively. And my question is, like, it seems to me that your reputation, unless I'm very misinformed about this, is as a strong supporter of Marxist doctrines on the left, or was that? And so then my question is, given the originality of your thought, why is it that you came to presume at some point in your life, perhaps not now and perhaps still, that the promotion of Marxism rather than Zizekism was appropriate? Because it seems to me that there's enough originality in your body of thought and lateral thinking in the manner in which you approach intellectual ideas that there's just no reason for you to be allied with a doctrine that's 170 years old and that is, if capitalism is rife with problems, is twice as rife with problems as that. And so you're kind of a mystery to me in that way. And so that's my question.
Okay. Very briefly, I developed systematically in my book critical insights into many traditional Marxist theses, so no doubt here. You know what I still admire nonetheless in Marx? Not those simplicities of Communist Manifesto, but I still think that his so-called critique of political economy, capital, and so on, is a tremendous achievement as a description of the dynamics of capitalist society. And if you read it closely, Marx is much more ambiguous and open there. For example, he mentions, for example, apropos what you referred to, he mentions that law of diminishing return, like why crisis will arrive necessarily, poor are getting poorer. But then he is honest enough to enumerate 7 or 8 counter tendencies. And if you read him closely, you will see that precisely those tendencies prevailed later. Or forget Communist Manifesto, go to read his political analysis of its unsurpassable 18 Brumaire and so on of the 1848 revolution, which are incredibly complex, no traces of that class binary there. Marx deals with middle classes with crucial, lumpen proletariat with the ambiguous role of intellectuals and so on and so on. But basically, what I was pleading for, and I like to put it in paradoxical terms, was for a return from Marx back to Hegel. I define myself more as a Hegelian. Why? Hegel is considered a madman, you know, the guy, absolute knowing, and so on and so on. No, Hegel is much more modest and open. The danger in Marxism is, for me, this teleological structure. We are at the 0 point, but there is a unique chance of a reversal into a new emancipated society and so on. And the danger here is that of self-instrumentalization. Proletarian Communist Party is an agent of history which knows the laws of history, to put it, follows them, and so on. That's the catastrophe. In Hegel, such a position is strictly prohibited. In Hegel, whenever you act, you err. So, you know, you have to, there is no position of this pure acting where you know what you are doing and the result will be. So I this would be my main point. So yes, my formula is kind of ironically, I know Hegel is the greatest idealist, materialist reversal of Marx by turning back to Hegel. For Hegel says in a part that people don't read, Introduction to Forward to Philosophy of Right, he says explicitly that the owl of Minerva takes off in the evening when there is dusk. So philosophy can just grasp a social order when it's already in its decay. Philosophy cannot see into the future. It's radical openness. We need this openness today. The tragedy today, maybe we agree here, is that we really don't have a basic, how should I call it, cognitive mapping. I don't think we have here a clear insight into where we stand, where we are moving, and so on and so on. So I'm much more, again, sincerely of a pessimist.
Please, yeah, reply.
Can I ask you now a question?
Let me
reply.
respond,
Yeah,
and then you can ask me a question.
Of course.
So,
Sorry.
well, I don't have anything to quibble about with what you just said.
But.
Well, no, there's not even a but, really. It's that even if what you said about Marx's more sophisticated thought is true, I think the unfortunate reality is that any support for Marxism, especially directed towards those who are young, is likely to be read as support for the most radical and revolutionary proclivities. And I would say that as they're outlined in the document that I described, in the Communist Manifesto, that they're of extraordinary danger. And so it seems to me that by attempting to, rescue the sheep, you've sort of invited the dragon into the house. And that seems to me to be dangerous and unfortunate.
Here I can answer you by asking you my question. Because, very naively, you mentioned, first, do you really, where did you find the data that I simply don't see it? Okay, let me begin by this. You designate your, under quotation marks, I'm not characterizing here, enemy, or what you are fighting against, as sometimes you call it postmodern neo-Marxism. I know what you mean. All this, from political correctness to these excesses of whatever, spirit of envy, and so on and so on. Do you think they are really, where did you find this data? I don't know them. I would ask you here, give me some names or whatever. Where are the Marxists here? I don't know any. Who is a Marxist here? Show me any big names of political correctness. I think they fear like a good vampire fears garlic. This is why they are already, the one who is not a Marxist, but at least approaches economic topic, Bernie Sanders, he is already under attack as white male and all that stuff and so on. My problem would be this one. What you describe as postmodern neo-Marxism, where is really the Marxist element in it? They are for equality. Sorry, where? They are for equality at these cultural struggles, proper names, how do we call each other? Do you see in them, in political correctness and so on, any genuine will to change society? I don't see it. I think it's a hyper-moralization, which is a silent admission of a defeat. That's my problem. Why do you call, it's not a rhetorical question for politely saying you are an idiot, you don't know what you're talking about. It's simply, I would like to know, because you, and I like this often, when you attack somebody, you said aggressively, and what should? Read more, tell me, whom. So I'm asking you now, not read more, I don't advise you, but who are? Give me some names and so on, and who are these postmodern, egalitarian, neo-Marxist, and where do you see any kind even of Marxism? I see in it mostly an impotent, an utterly impotent moralization. Please, I'm so sorry that I was too
No, that's no problem.
Please.
Well, I mean, organization like Jonathan Haidt's, what's it called? Heterodox Academy, and other organizations like that have documented an absolute dearth of conservative voices in the social sciences and the humanities, and about 25%, according to the what I think are reliable surveys, approximately 25% of social scientists in the US identify themselves as Marxists. And so there's that.
But where are the
Well,
results?
okay, but let,
Can you name me
let's
one? I know a couple of Marxists. For example, who does very solid economic work.
Yeah.
I don't totally. David Harvey. One, but he writes very serious books of economic analysis and so on and so on. Then there is the old guy who is far from simplification, Frederick Jameson and so on, but they are totally marginalized today. In this politically correct mainstream, you know, I don't see.
Well, yeah, your question seemed to me to focus more on the peculiar relationship that I've noticed and that people have disputed between postmodernism and neo-Marxism. And I see the connection between the postmodernist types and the Marxists as a sleight of hand that replaced the notion of the oppression of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie as the oppression by one identity group by another.
Totally agree with you.
Okay, so so now look, we could
but
have
that's precisely a non-Marxist gesture par excellence.
Well, that's the, see, I guess that's where we might have a dispute, because I think what happened, especially in France in the 1960s, is as the radical Marxist postmodern types like Derrida and Foucault realized that they were losing the moral battle, especially after the information came out of the Soviet Union in the manner that it came out, that the whole,
and so on.
yeah, that the whole bloody Stalinist, the whole Stalinist catastrophe, along with the entire Maoist catastrophe, that they didn't really have a leg to stand on. And instead of revising their notion that human history, and this is a Marxist notion, should be regarded as the eternal class struggle between the economically deprived and the oppressors, they just recast it and said, well, it's not based on economics, it's based on identity, but it's still fundamentally oppressor against oppressed. And to me, that meant that they smuggled the fundamental narrative of Marxism and many of its goals back into the argument without ever admitting that they did so. Now, I've been criticized, you know, for this supposition, because people who are postmodernists say, look, one of the hallmarks of postmodernism is skepticism of meta-narratives. It's like, I know that perfectly well. And I also know that Marxism is a meta-narrative, and so you shouldn't be able to be a postmodernist and a Marxist. But I still see the union of those two things in the insistence that the appropriate way to look at the world is to view it as the battleground between groups defined by a particular between individuals defined by a particular group identity, so that the group identity becomes paramount, and then the proper reading is always oppressor versus oppressed, with a secondary insistence that's very similar to Marx's insistence upon the moral superiority of the proletariat, that the oppressors are by definition, because they're oppressed, morally superior. And there's the call for perhaps not revolutionary change, although that comes up above, but change in the structure so that that oppression disappears, so that a certain form of equality comes about. Now, you argued that Marx wasn't a believer in equality of outcome, and I'm not so sure about that, because his notion of the eventual utopia that would constitute genuine communism was a place where all class divisions were eradicated.
And so there's hierarchies.
Well, there's at least an implication that the most important of the hierarchies had disappeared. And so maybe he had enough sophistication to talk about other forms of hierarchies, but if that's the case, then I can't imagine why he thought that the utopia that would emerge as a consequence of the elimination of economic hierarchies would be a utopia. Because if there were other forms of hierarchies that still existed, people would be just as contentious about them as they are now. Like we have hierarchies of attractiveness, for example, that have nothing to do with economics or very little to do with economics, and there's no shortage of contention around that or any other form of ability. And so that's why I associate the social justice types who are basically postmodernist with they're postmodernist with Marxism. It's the insistence that you view the world through the narrative of oppressed versus oppressor. And I think it's a catastrophe. I think it's a catastrophe. And you appear to think that it's a catastrophe as well.
Just one sentence and then you can reply. It's so strange that you mention, for example, somebody like Foucault, who, for me, are you aware that his main target was Marxism? Okay, for him represented his game was never a radical change, and this is what I don't like in this, what you call postmodern, let's not call them Marxists, but revolutionaries. It's this enjoying your own self-marginalization. The good thing is to be on the margin, you know, like not in the center and so on and so on. It almost made me nostalgic for old communists who at least had the honesty to say, no, we don't enjoy our marginal position. We want to do something central power. I find so disgusting.
It's no wonder you don't get invited to lots of places.
Yeah. No, you know, Foucault for me embodies this logic of revolution, and by revolution he meant any social change serious, that small resistances and so on, small marginal places of resistance and so on and so on. So, okay, but let's maybe drop it here if you want, but since you are replying my question, you should have the last word here.
No, I'll stop with that. Let's move to the next. We'll get back to these topics, no doubt, as we move forward with the question, so I'm happy to let that particular issue stall.